what is hypogonadism or low testosterone, and is that the only time that somebody would need TRT?
Okay, this is a good question because this is now I'm just going to rant like 20 minutes. So, firstly,
Yes.
I don't think anyone objectively needs TRT. You need cortisol, and that's about it. You don't need any other hormone. You can breathe and survive without testosterone. So no one, I don't think anyone technically needs it, but I think way more people than they realize could benefit from it. And that's how I would preface this. So, and I think you have a sliding scale of how much you would benefit from it based on how low your testosterone is to begin with. I just think that there is a spectrum of people above the hypergonadal cutoff that would benefit from it, and this is why. I think, and this is just my perspective, and people can disagree, that there are points that you get to in life where you get off track or you have a problem that you can't overcome and you need an intervention. And I think it's cool that these days there's less stigma around speaking and saying, I'm at that point. And sometimes people need a therapist. Sometimes I think SSRIs are appropriate for a short period. Absolutely. I think there are points where people need intervention. Sometimes that intervention is metformin. Sometimes the intervention is a personal trainer. And I think sometimes if you get to a point where you're like, I need an intervention, I think that there is a case for going, okay, maybe increasing your bioidentical natural testosterone level to what they could be a healthy level, even if they're not technically low enough to begin or technically in that hypergonadal range. Maybe that would be better for you in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but also your health outcomes than Vyvanse or methylphenidate or Zoloft. I think these are discussions that people should look at. So I think that men should be able to, or at least be open to having a discussion around augmenting their testosterone levels, assuming they understand that they know they're making a lifelong commitment and there's complications and all these different things. I think that that's one category. But with that said, the whole other part of this conversation, which I think is also worth looking at, is that I don't think it should be your first resort option. I think it should be the bazooka in the back pocket because there are so many things that you should do first. And if you go on TRT, you're going to have to do all those things anyway, but these things are way less invasive, right? And they're all the things that we spoke about last time. So I think coming back to the original question, I think when you should look at TRT or why you should look at TRT is at the point where you need an intervention because you can objectively sit back and assess what's going on and saying, I need assistance to achieve what I'm trying to achieve. I'm not doing well. And then I think that testosterone should be looked at as one of those interventions. You should be going to your doctor and saying, hey, I don't feel well. And rather than walking out with a SSRI script, you should be walking out with a blood test and maybe a referral to a therapist of some sort, or maybe a personal trainer, like all these different things you can do. And I think testosterone should be on that table, but it's a highly invasive thing to be doing. So it's a big commitment.
Right. Yeah, you call it the bazooka. I tell patients all the time it's the nuclear approach. That's the one that we can't really go back from. So let's try to exhaust all conservative options first. If none of that works, let's move on to the nuclear option, the thing that we can't really go back from, which isn't fully true. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later too. But something I definitely want you to kind of tease out for us is, do the readings on the labs really matter? So, is it after a certain threshold, say below 300, you absolutely need testosterone, or if you are above 500, you never need testosterone?
That's a very good question, Ben. And I like these questions because they're really, it depends on who you talk to answer. And I think that because there is not a consensus on what is technically correct here in terms of we don't have that actual hard evidence, I think there's a lot of different answers to this question that can be entertained. So personally, I'm a blood work guy as much as I am interested in symptoms. I don't like this idea of it's not about the blood work, it's about how you feel. I think that that's taken out of context. I think that that's when you're only myopically looking at one blood value. And I think that that's very true. One myopic blood value doesn't mean that much. But comprehensive blood work, I think, is more important, if not just as important as how you feel. Because you could go and take 500 milligrams a week of test, do a bunch of lines of coke, have some Jaeger bombs, and you would feel fantastic. But your blood work would look like shit.
Absolutely.
So like we have to look at this point and go, oh, well, it's all about how you feel. It's like that's the narrative in society that we're getting pummeled with these days. But that's not science. Science is I want your comprehensive blood panel, and I also want to know how you feel. It's a balance. So the thing I like about checking testosterone levels is that I like to at least match their symptoms to their testosterone levels. So we use different units in Australia. So I'm sorry. I'll speak relative to the reference range for the sake of the
Mhm.
conversation. Now, reference ranges are not the ranges for health. I know that, just for people who are, so, Dave, the reference range is bullshit. I know, but we'll just speak relative to reference ranges. So if someone is in, let's say, below the bottom of the reference range for free testosterone, that's low. Like that, to be at that point in 2023, you are low. So if you're at that point and you're like, I can't get out of bed in the morning, I feel fucking terrible, like I'd be like, okay, that makes sense. But if your free testosterone was, let's say, just like at the top of the bottom half of the range, and you're like, I can't get out of bed, I want to put a gun in my mouth, I can't build muscle and all these different issues, I'm going to go, well, you shouldn't be thriving with this level, but you shouldn't be feeling that bad. So there might be something else that we need to look at. Other systems of blood work, maybe they're more hypothyroid than low testosterone, or maybe their diet and lifestyle is just fucking trash, or maybe both. And that's something that needs to be looked at. So I like bloods in the scheme of comprehensive panels so that I can see what's going on. I don't think that there is a hard number that it's like below this you need TRT and above this you don't, because we've got androgen receptor issues, and there's quite a few doctors who've spoken about this. I know that Keith Nichols has a video on it. I know that other doctors do. I just can't remember who else has them, but you can search that up for androgen receptor resistance. But we can't check the receptor profile of an individual without doing an autopsy, and you're not going to survive that. So we can't do it. And I like to describe testosterone or hormones in the body like an old school pinball machine. So for the people who are too young, we used to have physical pinball machines. And when you play pinball, the ball flies around, but you don't get any points unless it hits the bumpers. Hormones are like that. They don't do shit until they activate the receptor. So we can't test
Mhm.
how your receptors are working, and we don't fully understand what's fucking up people's receptors. So the higher someone's testosterone is, the more I'm going to look for other things that could be causing their issue. The lower the testosterone is, I'm not going to completely disregard everything, but the more I'm like, okay, let's be a bit more gung ho with this approach. Because if it's not the testosterone issue and you put them on testosterone, you could make the problem worse, or you might have just signed them up for a lifelong intervention for something that wasn't appropriate.
Yep. Yeah, I love the mix of the two. That's exactly how I look at it too. I think that being too dogmatic about lab work only is, not great. So I have guys sometimes who come in and they have, a high 300 nanogram per deciliter. So for those US people listening, or outside the US, you would know that's almost to consider classic, medically hypogonadal. Sometimes like, I feel great, man. They're putting on good amounts of muscle. They have a great libido. I assume that potentially that's more towards the androgen receptor side of things, and their genomic response and their transcription, maybe they don't require a lot, because they feel good, and that's maybe all their physiology requires, and more may just put them into sympathetic overdrive and cause a host of issues. And then conversely, sometimes I'll have a guy who has a 500, which would be smack dab in the middle of normal, and they feel awful, and maybe they require more. And a lot of these guys, they're 40, and what's to say that 20 years ago they didn't have a 1000 nanogram per deciliter, so they have a 50% decline. It makes sense that they're not feeling optimal. So starting with lab work early in life is great, I think, too, so you have a reference to look back on, so that you can continually gauge your symptoms with your lab work throughout the years, because it's an art of melding the two of symptoms and lab work. And like you said, we have this new group that I never look at lab work. I just go solely off of how the patient feels. Well, that's absurd, especially because testosterone and its side effect, or its effects, or the symptoms that would present, can be kind of linked under so many other things. Things like, I feel tired, I have low libido, like these, so many things can cause this. Like testosterone is one of probably 100 mechanisms that could be irrelevant here. So why are we just blasting people with testosterone without even checking to see what their levels are?
Yeah, and it's symptom resolution is important, and there can definitely be reasons why someone needs more testosterone than another guy. Like I'm sure that you guys have got similar things. Like I'll speak about the reference range. I've got guys where if you take their free testosterone to about the top of the reference range, they feel fantastic. If you take it to double the top of the reference range, they, like, as you said, sympathetically dominant. I call it cranked. I think that's a good way to
Mhm.
describe sympathetic dominance. It's cranked.
Yeah.
It's like you're
Yeah.
on, but it's a bad kind of on. It's like that's what it is to be
Right.
cranked. But other guys, like myself, like I'll be very open about my levels. Is like I need to be closer to double the top of the reference range to get the same response as them at the top of the range. And then what I also think is important, which a lot of people don't look at, because previously, andropause was the only thing that we were treating with TRT, which was for older gentlemen. I just don't understand the idea of treating a 20-year-old and treating a 60-year-old with shooting for the same levels. It makes no sense. Um,
Mm.
and I think that needs to be taken into account. It's like if we've got younger guys coming up who are 21, 22, they're probably going to need more testosterone than a 40 or 50-year-old guy. Now, there might be exceptions to the rules, and there absolutely will be. But I also think that with the younger guys, there's a double whammy because we grew up with more plastics. We grew up in a more polluted environment. We grew up with poorer diet and lifestyle patterns, and the younger generation are only worse. I mean, I'm 30. The guys coming up who are 20, they're really problematic. So if anyone's going to have androgen receptor problem, it's also going to be the younger guys. So I'm not surprised when I see people who are, born in, let's say the 1990s versus 1980s, who need more testosterone levels to resolve their symptoms. So I think the blood work is important, but the blood work is important in context. Like we need to know where you're at because there are testosterone, and this is a thing that I know that guys get caught up on this, and I don't mean to sound patronizing to guys who feel this way because I understand it, but like testosterone is not the only barometer for your subjective experience of being alive. So if and I made this analogy the other day. I said, if you get up in the morning and you drive your car bad and your car doesn't drive right, you're not going to pull over and start ripping shit out of the bonnet and changing this and that because your car drove badly that day. So just because you woke up for a few days with a lower libido and a lower erection quality, or you needed a nap after lunch, it's probably something to do with life. And the testosterone level optimization should be left to your practitioner who's sorting things out, and you should just take your medication as it's prescribed.
Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I think those of us who have been on TRT or even TRT plus, steroid use, we know that testosterone is not the end all be all.
Mm.